Ladies and gentlemen, as chairman of the John Adams Institute, it is the great pleasure to welcome you tonight. It's a full house. We're very happy with that. We're not so much surprised knowing who is going to speak tonight. As a chairman, I will be very short because I'm at least as excited as you are to listen, but I have still a few things to say. First of all, I would like, of course, to welcome our speaker and his wife. We're very glad that you were sure you were there too. Also, I would like to welcome our Consul General from Amsterdam, the U.S. Where's Jake? I missed Jake. Okay. Jake, very nice to have you here. We are very happy with the cooperation you of your colleagues in Amsterdam and The Hague have given us in the start of the John Adams Institute. Mr. Buning, you will be the moderator, and I will turn over the meeting to you as soon as I can. I have a few questions. Would you please not smoke? And secondly, after a short introduction by Mr. Buning, Mr. Potok will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we have a very short intermission. Just a very short intermission, and I would be pleased if you let Mr. Potok leave first before you stretch your legs. We will start very quickly thereafter. We have an opportunity for discussion, questions and answers with Mr. Potok, and we all hope after this meeting you will join us in another room for a glass of wine. And as I told Mr. Potok, then he's on his own. We will not protect him anymore. It's up to you. Mr. Buning, may I turn the over to you?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker to you, Dr. Herman Harold, born in the Bronx, New York, also known as Chaim Tzvi in Hebrew, but best known to us under the pen name of Chaim Potok, the Living River. He is, as you all know, the author of 6 widely acclaimed novels, that the first of which, The Chosen, has also been turned into a major film in 1982. His fictions have captured the imagination of millions of readers all over the world, and not least in Holland, where they are read by the young and the old, by believers and disbelievers, by the common and the sophisticated reader alike. One is left wondering why his novels possess such a worldwide appeal, although on the face of it they seem to be dealing with a relatively small minority American immigrant subculture. Yet paradoxically enough, it is precisely because his novels are solidly embedded in a particular time and place and cultural context that they can indeed lay claim to universal appeal and value. For as James Joyce once remarked, in the particular is contained the universal. If I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of the world. I suggest that both Dublin and the Brooklyn Hasidic community, in all their variety and complexity, become, each in their own unique way, metaphors for the universe and for the human condition. According to the 19th century philosopher, critic, and historian Thomas Carlyle, literature is the wine of life. And according to the psalmist, wine maketh glad the heart. We know that through the centuries, wine has been associated with truth and wisdom, and also with intoxication and illusion. Indeed, as Erasmus said, there is truth in wine. The metaphor of literature as the wine of life seems to be an appropriate one when trying to describe the experience of reading valuable works of literature, in which the thoughts of wise men and women of all ages and countries are gathered in different blends, strengths, and colors. Chaim Potok's novels give us a deep drink of life and do not fail to affect us profoundly. As you know, good wine needs no bush, and likewise his novels need no further praise from me. Mr. Chaim Potok, we are absolutely delighted to have you in our midst tonight, and we are greatly looking forward to your address, which is entitled Literature and Religious Authority, the Writer Against the World. A subject that concerns us all in these disturbing days of upsurging fundamentalism, which causes again books to be forbidden and burnt. It has even put author Salman Rushdie's life under the threat of death. As readers of your work, we are also immensely grateful to the John Adams Institute that invited you to be the first guest speaker in their most promising and ambitious series of lectures by contemporary American authors, whose work has been translated into Dutch. In your case, this means that by now all of your works have been translated into Dutch. And with this week's publication of Omzwervingen, which is Dutch for your fascinating book Wanderings, History of the Jews, all of your work is now translated thanks to the dedication of Besto, your Dutch publishing house. One last remark, ladies and gentlemen, before turning you over to Chaim Potok to deliver his address. For the record, I would like to point out that after the lecture there will be a quarter of an hour's interval, as the chairman has already said. In the hall of this magnificent building you will see an exhibition of Chaim Potok's works, and you'll also see a very small stand displaying an interesting series of small books published by the Vrije Universiteit Press, called Joods-Amerikaanse Literatuur. If you wish, you can also hand in questions and comments that you would want to make in written form, and you can hand these in to this table during the interval. After the interval, we're going to have a good hour's discussion, which will be in English, but in case you prefer to speak Dutch, I'll be very happy to act as a mediator. I should also like to point out that it is one of the aims of the John Adams Institute to encourage a creative dialogue between the guest speaker and Dutch authors. To this end, we have invited several writers to respond to tonight's speaker. But let me assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not going to be small circle or in-crowd talk. Everybody will have a chance, within the limits, of course, set by the clock, to ask questions and to state opinions. I would only like to remind you that tonight's subject is a literary one. Although literature is a multi-leveled and multifaceted activity, and to that extent equals and imitates life, it is an almost boundless subject. It would seem an almost boundless subject for discussion of religion, psychology, politics, ethics, and what have you. But I suggest that our comments and our concerns should remain primarily and ultimately literary rather than anything else. In saying this, I'm sure I act in accordance with Chaim Potok's own conviction, which he once most pregnantly formulated as follows: I advocate nothing in my fiction. I look, I absorb, I gaze into my own mirror, I write. That is all I know to do on earth, and all I want you to know. May I now ask you, sir, to deliver your address. Ladies and gentlemen, Chaim Potok.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to be with you here this evening. It's a very special honor and privilege for me to be initiating this series of lectures named after an individual very important in the history of my country. I happen to have a particular passion for the gentleman who created the country in which I live, and this particular gentleman is a noted one indeed, Mr. Adams. It's a special privilege for me to be in the presence of a representative of my country, and thank you for being here. Probably it will come as no great surprise to this audience when I remind you that 200 and more years ago, most people on this planet were born, grew up, lived their lives, died, and never encountered a stranger or a new idea in their lifetimes. Now ponder that for a moment. You were born. You lived the only life you would ever have inside the small and particular world into which you were born. You never traveled more than 25 miles from the point of your birth unless you were a member of the aristocracy, and very few were, a member of the clergy, and very few were, a member of the military, and in those days very few were. Even if you lived inside a teeming city, you lived and worked inside your quarter of the city. And if you had business dealings with someone outside your quarter, you never really learned about the life of that individual. Lived and died inside the value system into which you were born. Today, every one of us is born inside a small and particular world. The world of a church, the world of a synagogue, the world of a neighborhood, the world of a family, the world of a small town. And very early on, we learn in varying degrees the value system of that small and particular world. And very early on, there begin to push against the walls of our world ideas and values that come to us from outside our small and particular worlds. You are taught by your parents or your relatives or your church to deal with a given ethical and moral dilemma in a specific way. You turn on the television set, there is that dilemma dealt with in an altogether different way. And that different way seems to make a measure of sense to you. You are taught by your family to handle yourself in a given situation this way. People move into your neighborhood. They have children your age. You become friendly with the children. You see the identical situation handled in an altogether different way by your new friends. We are bombarded day and night by values and ideas that constantly come to us from outside the small and particular worlds into which we're born. It makes no difference whatsoever what the world is into which we're born. Christian, Jewish, secular, atheist, agnostic, no difference whatsoever. We are incessantly challenged. We think it's a normal way to live. It isn't more than about 200 years old in the history of our species. Now, as we grow up, we encounter these ideas in a variety of ways. And by the time we're out of our teens and into our 20s and have begun to settle down and raise our own families, we have built for ourselves our own world of values, and we really don't like to have that world of values challenged in a significant way. It is very upsetting to have your whole system of values disrupted for you. We meet these ideas in a number of ways, and we don't even think about how we meet new ideas. It's very much like learning to walk. We do it after a while automatically. What I would like to do this evening is show you a number of ways that we confront ideas alien to us, and show you at the same time how some of the really great works of literature of the modern period have focused upon the different ways that we confront values and ideas from outside our own systems of belief and thought. How some of these worlds of literature have focused upon these different ways and present them to you for your consideration. I'm going to take you through a model of culture confrontation, clashes of values and ideas. And I'm going to take you through it step by step, beginning with what it is that I'm trying to do in my own work, and then through the works of some other modern and contemporary writers. Here we go. It probably will come as a surprise to most of you here when I tell you that as far as my own particular tradition is concerned, the Jewish tradition, the rabbinic Jewish tradition, this business of being a writer of stories is of no importance whatsoever. Of all the things that I might have done with my life, writing stories in the things in my own tradition, which my tradition regards as important, writing stories is somewhere very low on the list. Scholarship, that's the measure of an individual in my small and particular world. Especially scholarship having to do with the Talmud. Writing stories. Now, I know there are stories in Judaism. There are great stories in the Bible, great stories in the Talmud, great stories in midrashic texts, great stories all through the medieval period. But those are essentially tribal tales. They're stories generated by the value system of the community. Their essential purpose is to enhance that value system, to reinforce that value system, to get people to regard that value system with value. Stories generated out of the private imagination of an individual, trying to make personal sense out of the world. Stories that are often against the way the community sees the world. That's very new, very modern, and often very upsetting to a general community. That kind of story writing is a very strange enterprise in my tradition, in most traditions. My mother, of blessed memory, very religious lady, rather sophisticated, went to a gymnasium for a while in Vienna during the First World War. My mother used to tell me from time to time how proud she was of what I'd managed to do with my life. Told me when one of my novels was published, My Name is Asher Lev, that she was down in a place in the United States called Miami Beach in the state of Florida, vacationing during the late winter and early spring. And people started to buy the book in the bookstores. And they discovered that there was somebody named Potok somewhere in that area. So they hunted her out. And they brought their copies of the novel over to her for her to sign. And she sat there on her beach chair signing, Molly Potok, mother of the author Chaim Potok. For the longest time, I thought the story was apocryphal, the sort of tale a mother might tell a son who from time to time doubts the essential integrity of the enterprise to which he's dedicated his life. Until one evening, somewhere in the Midwest in the United States, during a lecture, I told the story. I don't know why I told the story. And when the lecture was over and people were leaving the auditorium, a sweet little old lady came over to me with a copy of My Name is Asher Lev, and there was my mother's signature. And she asked me to sign under it, Chaim Potok, son of the mother Molly Potok. With it all, there used to be times when I was alone in a room with my mother when I would catch her looking at me out of the corner of her eye as if to say she wasn't quite sure what it was that her son was doing with his life, with his business of writing stories. And it wasn't too difficult for me at such moments to remember her reaction to me when I was about 15 and a half, 16 years old, and I told her one evening that I would probably spend my life writing stories. She looked at me. "You want to write stories, darling? That's very nice. You'll be a brain surgeon. On the side, you'll write stories." How does it come about that someone profoundly dedicated to his particular world, his tradition, takes up with an instrumentality, writing stories, which that tradition regards at best as something of no importance, a frivolity, and at worst as an out-and-out menace, a threat? The story that I'm about to tell you is a story of a confrontation of ideas of a special kind, the kind that I'm trying to explore in my novels. I was about 15 and a half, 16 years old. It was at the end of a high school term for me. I was done with all my exams, and I knew that I would have time on my hands in the following week. And in my world, time on one's hands meant time to read. And I decided to try reading a really difficult adult novel. I had not read a difficult adult novel before. Went to the public library in my neighborhood, took down from a shelf a novel, the title of which intrigued me, couldn't even pronounce the name of the author, brought the book over to the librarian and asked the librarian, "Is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh serious adult fiction?" The librarian said, "Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh is very serious adult fiction." I said, "Evelyn Waugh, is she really a good writer?" She said, "He is a very good writer." I grew up in a neighborhood in New York, and in that neighborhood in New York, no one named Evelyn or Evelyn was a he. This librarian had been tracking my reading over the years, and she knew I was about to make an intergalactic leap in literature. And she urged me to be very patient with this book. It isn't just another story. It's a very special kind of exploring of a world you know nothing about. You owe this kind of book an investment of 75 or 100 pages of effort before you decide whether or not you want to continue reading it. I took the book home. Brideshead Revisited, as everybody knows, is a novel about an upper-class English Catholic family in the decades before the Second World War. The mysterious personality and powerful faith of the mother of that family, the wavering faith of the daughter of that family, and the disintegrating faith of the boy in that family, and the falling apart of his own inner being, and the slow coming to that faith of the individual who was telling the story. Now, I was a yeshiva boy. I attended a Jewish parochial high school, a very Orthodox Jewish high school in New York City. I used to get up at 6:30 every morning. I would get dressed. I would pray the morning service. I'd have breakfast. I'd get on a bus. I'd be in school about 8:45. From 9 to 1, we studied our sacred subjects, which in my school consisted solely of Talmud. From about 1:30 or 2 to 5 or 6, depending upon the day's schedule, we studied our secular subjects. I'd get on a bus. I'd get home. I'd have my supper. I'd do my homework. I'd go to sleep. If I was lucky, I would catch a radio program once or twice a week called The Lone Ranger. If I was really lucky, I would be able to tune in to a symphony or some classical music on a local New York station, WQXR. And if I made it to the radio programs called Gangbusters and the Green Hornet, it was a messianic week for me. That was the way I lived my life. Up in the morning, school all day, home, supper, homework, sleep, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. You can imagine that I knew a great deal about upper-class English Catholics. I'll never forget the effect that this book had upon me. There were times when I wanted to stop reading. Very difficult world for me to get into. And I kept remembering the urgings of the librarian, and I stuck with it. And indeed, somewhere around page 80 or 90, I grew accustomed to the very special style in that book, the very special way that Waugh uses language. I found myself inside the feelings of the people of the book, feeling their feelings, thinking their thoughts. I remember walking the streets from the bus stop to my school, day after day, lost in awe at the strange personality and the tenacious faith of the mother of that Catholic family. I remember sitting in the classroom in my Talmud class with my eyes closed. My teacher thought I had fallen asleep. I was sitting there asking myself about the daughter in that family. Will she remain a Catholic? Won't she remain a Catholic? I remember trying to fall asleep at night, lost in the horror of the disintegration of the personality of the boy in that family. I lived more deeply inside the world of that book than I lived inside my own world for the length of time it took me to read it. I remember finishing it. It was in the living room of our apartment in New York, closing it, looking down at it, and feeling an overwhelming sense of loss, of bereavement. These people were gone from me now. And then feeling utterly astonished. What had he done to me, Evelyn Waugh? The whole thing had only been a story. How do you take words and utilizing the faculty of the human imagination, so fuse words and imagination onto empty sheets of paper that out of that fusion comes a world more real to the reader than the world in which the reader is actually living his or her daily life? What power there is in this kind of creativity. That was the beginning of it for me. The beginning of this strange commitment to write stories. I don't fully understand it to this day. I can talk about the when of it, the where of it, the what of it, and I do often. The why of it I leave to psychoanalysts who also need to earn a living. And everything that I read in fiction from that point on, even trivial fiction, had as its fundamental purpose to teach me how to create worlds out of words on paper. I began to read, and I began to write. Well, you didn't do anything of a very special nature in my small New York Jewish world before someone in authority discovered what it was that you were doing. So one afternoon, as we were leaving our Talmud class, my teacher called me over to him, and when we were alone, he said to me, "What is this that I hear?" speaking in Yiddish. I said, "What do you mean? What is this that you hear?" He said, "I hear you want to be a writer." I said, "Yes." He said, "What is it that you want to write?" And I said, "Stories." And he was horrified. Stories. My God, wasn't it enough that we had to spend every afternoon of the school day involved in secular studies in order for the school to be licensed by the state of New York? I had to add to that. And evenings and weekends, when I should be studying the sacred texts of the tradition, write stories instead. Judaism is a word world. It's a book world. The central commandment in the Jewish tradition is the study of the texts of the tradition. And a fundamental transgression takes place when you waste time, when you steal time from the study of the texts of the tradition. It was this that concerned my teacher of Talmud. He was a very wise Eastern European Jew. This and something else. Something more to the point of my words to you this evening. He sensed that I had somehow made contact with the general civilization in which all of us live our lives today, and to which all of us contribute our best energies. This civilization that's about 300 years old has its beginnings with the Enlightenment in Western and Central Europe in the 1700s. The civilization that replaced the previous general civilization on the western side of our planet, the civilization we call Christendom, which replaced Rome, which replaced Greek civilization. We, all of us together, constitute this general civilization. We call it variously humanism, secular humanism, Western secular humanism, modernism, postmodernism. All of us together contribute to and participate in this or that aspect of this civilization. And insofar as my teacher of Talmud was concerned, any contact with that civilization was inimical to, adversary to, what he took to be the essential nature of my small and particular world, the Jewish tradition. Especially contact with the literature of that civilization. And he tried very hard to dissuade me from this strange love affair that I was experiencing with this alien goddess called serious modern fiction, literature. And he could not. And that was the beginning of rather difficult times between myself and that teacher and other teachers I had in that school. Though in all candor, there was some who tried very hard to understand what it was that I wanted to do with my life. And as it turned out, he was right. He was absolutely right. He sensed something about the nature of the enterprise we call modern literature that I, as a hungry teenager, was simply unable to perceive at that point in my life. What do you do if you want to become a serious writer? I wasn't interested in using storytelling for the purpose of entertaining only, though I don't denigrate that. That's a very special craft of its own, and it has some marvelous practitioners. I wanted to use storytelling for the purpose of exploring I knew not what at that point in my life. Well, there's no secret about becoming a writer. You read and you write. You read and you write. You make the great masters who created modern literature your teachers. You enter a long tunnel of an apprenticeship. You can't be certain you'll ever get to the end of that tunnel. You read and you write and the years go by. And you discover as the years go by that you've entered a tradition. It's a tradition we call modern literature. In the English language, it pretty much has its beginnings with novels written in letter form by an Englishman named Richardson. And you discover also, as the years go by, that this tradition has its own way of looking at the world. It is, by and large, the way of looking of the rebel, the iconoclast, the breaker of images, the individual who grows up inside a small and particular world and learns the value system of that small and particular world. And in the growing up, begins to sense the games that people sometimes play. the masks that people sometimes wear, the small and large hypocrisies that are often the mechanisms of defense by means of which we make our way through this very difficult business called living. And as that individual continues to grow, if those games and those masks and those hypocrisies become intolerable to her or to him, it seems to me that one of three possibilities is open to such an individual. One, he or she can break with the world that gave him or her life and never return to it, and be filled with all the self-doubt and all the guilt and all the concerns and all the mixed up feelings that attend an individual's break with his or her past. Or two, he or she can break with that world, return to it, break with that world, return to it, live in constant tension with it, and be filled with all the doubt and all the guilt that attends that kind of relationship to one's past. Or three, he or she can say, I quit the fight. No more strength for fighting. Join that world, marry in it, raise children in it, watch the children grow up, wonder which of the three steps the kids will take when they make their first solo flights into the real world, and be filled with all the guilt and all the self-doubt that attends that kind of decision, asking yourself at the age of 40, did I do the right thing? Did I do the right thing by staying inside? What might my life have been if I had gone out on my own? For the past 300 years, on our side of the planet only, the western side of the planet, for complex cultural reasons that I'll talk about in a moment, individuals have been using one of the earliest forms of communication known to our species, the folk tale, the story. We, Homo sapiens, love a story. Not entirely certain why. We're around on this planet as a distinct species for about 100,000 or so years. And we can only track ourselves for the last 5,000 or 6,000 of those years through writing. And at the very beginning of writing, there is already the attempt on the part of Homo sapiens to make sense out of what we do on this planet, to organize our activities in such a way that we can talk about them, communicate them to one another through the medium of the story, the use of words and the arabesques of the human imagination, to take the chaos of experience and shape it, model it, fashion it in such ways that enable us to talk about them, to transmit them. And for the past 300 years, men and women have been using this fundamental form of communication for the purpose of focusing upon this tense line of relationship that has grown up in the modern period between an individual born into a system of values and the tension that develops inside that individual between herself and himself and that system of values. George Steiner, in his extraordinary little book, In Bluebeard's Castle, attributes this tension, this rebelliousness on the part of the artist, to a remarkable phenomenon that occurred in the wake of the French Revolution. The French Revolution released enormous creative energies in that part of Europe. Indeed, you may know that the French were going to recycle the calendar and start again with the year one. That came very close to being passed by the French. All the world was recreated in the wake of that extraordinary, explosive moment in the history of the western side of our planet. And in the decades that followed the end of Napoleon, a whole new class of creature came onto the center stage of power, the bourgeois class. And all the flourish of the revolution was slowly stifled by that class, says George Steiner. And the attendant hope for freedom, openness of expression, new ideas that the artist felt in the wake of the revolution was stifled, frustrated. And from that point on in the history of Western civilization, the artist has felt himself and herself as positioned against the value system of the bourgeoisie. One might make a strong case for the fact that with the industrialization process that took place in Western Europe and the subsequent alienation that individuals felt as they were caught up in this process, one had meat indeed, substance indeed, for an artist to feel himself and herself separated from the daily world and its system of values. The world is not as it ought to be. And the contemporary artist lives in a perpetual state of, one might call it, sacred dissatisfaction with what it is that he and she sees and writes about that satisfaction. The artist against the world. That's the nature of contemporary literature. In my country, the paradigmatic novel that states this position is Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. A child can read Huckleberry Finn. It is not a child's book. Sometimes I think the only two people in the United States who really understood what Huckleberry Finn was all about when it was first published were Mark Twain, and I'm not too sure about Mark Twain, and that librarian outside of Boston who banned it from her library. That's the business of Boston librarians. To understand the essentially subversive nature of books like Huckleberry Finn. Somewhere around page 5, the little old lady who's trying hard to raise this quite difficult boy turns out to be a bit of a hypocrite, and he's upset by that. Somewhere around page 30, his father tries to kill him. Huck heads for the river. And scholars have pointed out how the book is structured. Huckleberry Finn floating on that raft between the banks of the Mississippi. The towns of the Mississippi represented American Mississippi River civilization at that point in our history as a nation. Isn't it extraordinary how virtually each and every time old Huck sets foot in one of these centers of civilization, people are shot down dead in the street? One family wipes out another family in a blood feud. There is murder, brutality, savagery, hypocrisy, every time that poor boy sets foot in civilization. Was it really that way in the United States at that point in America's history as a country? Well, who cares? That's the way Mark Twain perceives it. That's his model that he's offering us of that point in our history. And it's an interesting model indeed. That's the condition of civilization, of culture at that point. And that boy alone, by himself on that raft, in tension with that world from which he came, that boy on that raft goes on a voyage of moral self-discovery, discovers who he is as a person, away from the value system in which he was raised. And indeed, discovers the value of an individual who on land he would have regarded as an object, the value of the slave Jim. He says to himself, my conscience is telling me to return that slave or I'll burn in hell. And he says to himself, it can't be right to return that slave. I don't care. My conscience was formed by the value system I left behind. This tension, this polarization, tension of opposites between small and particular worlds of value on the one hand, and an individual suddenly looking for a new way to perceive the world on the other hand. This polarization constitutes one of the great themes in modern literature. Not the only theme, but probably the profoundest theme. The theme from which I learned the most as I was growing up, reading and teaching myself to write. In France, an individual polarized against the provinciality of small-town French life and its strange system of values about the middle of the last century. American Mississippi River civilization at that point in our history as a nation. Isn't it extraordinary how virtually each and every time old Huck sets foot in one of these centers of civilization, people are shot down dead in the street? One family wipes out another family in a blood feud. There is murder, brutality, savagery, hypocrisy, every time that poor boy sets foot in civilization. Was it really that way in the United States at that point in America's history as a country? Well, who cares? That's the way Mark Twain perceives it. That's his model that he's offering us of that point in our history. And it's an interesting model indeed. That's the condition of civilization, of culture at that point. And that boy alone, by himself on that raft, in tension with that world from which he came, that boy on that raft goes on a voyage of moral self-discovery, discovers who he is as a person, away from the value system in which he was raised, and indeed discovers the value of an individual who on land he would have regarded as an object, the value of the slave Jim. He says to himself, my conscience is telling me to return that slave or I'll burn in hell. And he says to himself, it can't be right to return that slave. I don't care. My conscience was formed by the value system I left behind. This tension, this polarization, tension of opposites between small and particular worlds of value on the one hand, and an individual suddenly looking for a new way to perceive the world on the other hand. This polarization constitutes one of the great themes in modern literature. Not the only theme, but probably the profoundest theme. The theme from which I learned the most as I was growing up, reading and teaching myself to write. In France, an individual polarized against the provinciality of small-town French life and its strange system of values about the middle of the last century. And what happens to that individual? Madame Bovary by Flaubert. In Ireland, an individual polarized against the static, swamp-like quality of turn-of-the-century Dublin life. The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. In Germany, individuals polarized against the rotting bourgeois class in the decades before the First World War. Buddenbrooks, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. In the United States, individuals polarized against the vacuousness, the utter emptiness of small town prairie life in the early decades of this century. Main Street, Babbitt, and so on, by Sinclair Lewis. Individual polarized against all of Western civilization, a civilization that sent tens and tens and tens of thousands of its young men to their deaths during the trench warfare of the First World War, mouthing at them slogans like, "It's for the king, it's for the Kaiser, motherland, fatherland, courage, honor, bravery," slaughtered its young men for slogans. And at the same time would throw up its arms in horror should one young man fall in love with one young woman and for whatever the reason be unable to marry her and they have a child out of wedlock. Which is the greater moral obscenity, Ernest Hemingway asks us in A Farewell to Arms? A civilization that slaughters its young men this way, or this kind of love affair? Nothing is sacred to the modern novelist. The modern novel has been a steady march from salon, drawing room, dining room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, to the very insides of the human being. Nothing is so sacred an inheritance from the past that it can't be poked into and opened up by the pen of the novelist, very often at high risk, as we know all too well today. If you grow up inside a civilization 3,000 and more years old, things are sacred. And if in the growing up no one messes up your particular world for you in an irreversible way, you have questions, patient teachers try to answer them. More important, you had problems, patient parents tried to respond to them. They lived what they taught you. They didn't teach you one set of values and live by another set of values. If this has been your particular instance, chances are, no guarantees, chances are, that you will come out of your teens inside this small and particular world appreciating, really understanding what it is that your world has to say and what it is that it can contribute to the world at large. Committed to that small and particular world and its special vision of the human being's place in it. And if at the same time you've taken up with this instrumentality called literature, right from the heart of the general civilization in which we live, by the time you're 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, you will discover that in altogether unexpected fashion, you've become a battleground of ideas and values, a battleground of a very special kind. Born into a small and particular world and raised right at its center, going to its best schools, understanding how it thinks the world, you have encountered an element from the very heart of the general civilization in which all of us live. Literature. Literature is a central effort of Western man. It is one of the ways Western man organizes the world, thinks the human experience, constructs what it is that he wants to believe about the world. I call this kind of experience, for lack of a better term, I call this kind of experience a core, C-O-R-E, a core to core culture confrontation. An individual raised in the very heart of one particular culture, encountering an element or elements from another culture, right from the heart of that other culture. Core, center, core to core culture confrontation. At the heart of this general civilization in which all of us live reside the following individuals among many others. All of us know their names: Rousseau, Diderot, Voltaire, Kant, Hume, Darwin, Marx, Freud, Einstein, Kafka, Joyce, Picasso, Stravinsky. At the heart of my particular world, and here substitute names from your worlds, who are at the core of your small and particular worlds. At the heart of my small and particular world reside, among others, the following individuals. Hillel, one of the greatest rabbis of the Talmud. Akiva, another of the very great rabbis of the Talmud. Maimonides, probably the greatest of the medieval rabbis and theologians and philosophers. Ibn Ezra, one of the greatest Spanish Jewish commentators on the Bible. Rashi, probably the greatest of the French, German, Jewish commentators on the Bible and the Talmud. Isaac Luria, one of the greatest of the medieval mystics, late medieval mystics, and so on. Core culture confrontation. A culture, this word that I'm using this evening, is a very strange and mysterious creation on the part of members of our species. We do not know how cultures are created by Homo sapiens. We pick up cultures when writing begins. Sometime in the distant past, members of our species finding themselves together on an island somewhere, in a desert somewhere, in a river valley somewhere, felt constrained to come up with collective responses to what I call the 4 o'clock in the morning questions. The questions that we don't like to ask ourselves during the day, and we keep ourselves very busy instead, and sometimes they wake us up in the early hours of the morning and we lie there in the darkness and listen to them swarming all around us. What am I doing here? What is this really all about? Does anything that I do with my life really mean anything in any significant way? What am I really ready to go to the barricades for? Who cares? What is this thin ribbon of light that I traverse between the darkness from which I came and the darkness toward which I am inevitably headed? 4 o'clock in the morning questions. A culture, a civilization, is a hard response to these ultimate questions. A response that elicits loyalty on the part of its members, loyalty at times to the death, and a response unified by a recognizable style. And we don't even know how styles of culture develop, but we recognize styles of culture. We recognize a French style, an Italian style. We recognize, by and large, a Christian style, a Jewish style, a Japanese style. When one set of these responses crashes up against another, enormous tension is generated. And the occasion for the confrontation is trivial. Merchants meeting at a convention somewhere, armies clashing on a field of combat, a scholar walking into an old library and picking off a shelf a dusty tome and opening it and reading. You look at that other answer to those 4 o'clock in the morning questions and you say to yourself, wait a minute. They seem to make an awful lot of sense. This new and different way of looking at the world. Should I rethink my own way of looking at the world? Very often you say to yourself, I don't want to be bothered by this. I have to make a living. I have a family to raise. And you walk away from the confrontation. Sometimes you're so upset by the confrontation you don't know how to respond. Paralysis results. That's what happens to the boy Michael in the second of my novels, The Promise. Sometimes the confrontation is so overwhelming that one culture is literally swept away by the other culture. It depends at what stages of development the two cultures are at. An old, tired, doddering culture can be very profoundly affected by a confrontation with a new, powerful, creative, seminal culture. Sometimes, out of the ensuing confrontation and its tension, creativity is generated. A response comes forth. Somebody writes a book. Somebody writes a piece of music. Somebody makes a painting. Gold is given to us that we mine for the rest of our existence as a species. A medieval rabbi encounters the thought of a long-dead Greek pagan. Tension is generated in that rabbi. He is awed by the mind of that pagan. It is inconceivable to that rabbi that the thinking of that pagan isn't found somewhere inside his living, revealed tradition, and he turns the tradition upside down and reinterprets it in order to find the thinking of that pagan in it, and the Jewish tradition has never been the same since. Years and years later, a Catholic thinker encounters the manuscripts and translation of that same Greek pagan. The same tension is generated in the Catholic. He's familiar with the writings of the rabbi. He writes in response some of the greatest works of medieval theology. The rabbi Maimonides, the Catholic Aquinas, the Greek pagan Aristotle. In our own time, one of the greatest painters who ever lived encountered what to him was new. He hadn't seen it before. It was fairly old. A different way of depicting the human figure. Enormous tension was generated in that painter. Out of that tension came a new way of depicting the human figure, indeed a new way of depicting the world, and an altogether different way that we now have of seeing the world. Our eyes look at the world differently from the way they did about 100 years ago. The painter, Picasso. The old new way of seeing the world, the human figure, African art. The result, Cubism and modern art. Over and over and over again, when cores of culture have met in confrontation, out of the ensuing tension has come creativity that enriches us all, and each time takes us just that much farther away from the dark magic of our beginnings. The Chosen is about the core of my own small and particular world, and its confrontation with one of the great gifts to us from the general civilization in which we live, Freudian psychoanalytic theory. How do you feel? How do you talk to your parents? How do you relate to your friends, your teachers? What do you do at night when you try to fall asleep? As the world in which you grew up is suddenly challenged by a powerful new idea from outside it. That's what happens in The Chosen. In The Promise, the confrontation is with a new way of looking at the great texts, ancient texts of Western civilization. A new way given to us by a new science called text criticism. How do you continue to respect a text you're learning to take apart? In My Name is Asher Lev, the confrontation is with Western art. The Jewish people has contributed virtually to everything in Western civilization except, until the modern period, its art. Because Western art was inextricably linked with the general civilization on the western side of our planet, Christendom. And Judaism and Jews clearly could not participate in Christendom. So Jews never participated in Western art. What happens if you're born into the heart of the Jewish tradition and you find yourself depending upon your point of view, blessed or cursed with a hunger to enter the mainstream of Western art. There are no Jewish motifs in Western art. There are no Jewish aesthetic molds in Western art except the few introduced by individuals like Rembrandt. How do you paint inside those essentially Christian themes? That's the dilemma that confronts Asher Lev in My Name is Asher Lev. And in the beginning, the confrontation is with a radical new way of looking at the central text of Western civilization, the Bible. No fundamentalism knows how to relate to this new secular instrumentality called Bible criticism. That's the confrontation that confronts David Lurie in the beginning. In the Book of Lights, the confrontation is with the only paganism left on this planet, the paganism in Asia and its juncture with Western civilization at Hiroshima. Wanderings, the history, is about all the different kinds of confrontations experienced by the Jewish people through the millennia as it encountered over and over again various umbrella civilizations in different parts of the planet. And the latest of the novels, Davita's Harp, is about the confrontation between two fundamentalisms. One, the materialist fundamentalism we call Marxism, and on the other hand, the religious fundamentalism we call an orthodoxy. In this instance, Jewish orthodoxy. Core confrontations of culture. That's one way that we encounter ideas that come to us outside the small and particular worlds into which we're born. Now, clearly, it's not the only way. And very briefly, I will give you 2 or 3 other ways, and you'll understand something about this choreography of confrontation that we all experience. Now I'm going to tell you another story. Some years ago, I spent the Passover festival, it's a spring festival, in the apartment of my in-laws. They lived at the time in Brooklyn, about a block and a half away from one of the great religious pietist sects in contemporary Jewry, a pietist sect called the Lubavitcher Hasidim. Hasid means pietist. They came originally from a town in Russia called Lubavitch. They lived, my in-laws at the time, about a block and a half away from the world headquarters of this sect. It's 770 Eastern Parkway, and my in-laws lived at the time in 576. 7th day of Passover, my wife asks me to take our big tricolored Scotch collie down for a walk. Now, these pietists, by and large, don't have too much contact with the essentially secular civilization outside their borders. Certainly no viable, significant culture contact. I'm walking along Eastern Parkway with this big collie. Coming toward me is one of these Lubavitcher families on the way to synagogue for the afternoon service. The youngest one was about 5 years old. He takes a look at this collie, turns to his father and says in Yiddish, I'll tell you his words in English, he says, "Daddy, give a look. That's Lassie." How'd that kid know about Lassie? Lassie is everywhere in Western civilization. We breathe Lassie. And I don't think too many of us would be too hard put to admit to ourselves that Lassie is not exactly a core component of Western civilization. Lassie is a peripheral element of Western civilization, and as far as that boy is concerned, all of Western civilization has precisely the same value as Lassie. Kant, Hume, Rousseau, Diderot, Lassie, Shakespeare, all has the same value. It's not a significant culture. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Not a culture significantly enough viable for him to want to really get into it and grapple with its system or systems of value. That boy will experience a core, he's right at the heart of the Jewish tradition, a core periphery culture confrontation. And it is almost always the case that when you're located solidly at your core, you can absorb elements from the periphery of another threatening culture and not be altered in any significant way. I suspect that you here can absorb all the American television we can ship you. I spent a whole summer writing my new novel in southern France. The French are now watching vintage 1970s, early 1980s television in perfect French. They're marvelous dubbers. Believe me, the essential nature of French civilization will not be altered with their encounter with American television. They're going to have a very interesting notion as to what American civilization is all about. In a core periphery confrontation, the core by and large holds firm. So there are two ways that we encounter worlds outside our world. Core, my experience, core periphery. Here's a third way. You can grow up along the periphery of your particular culture, not learn it very well for whatever the reason, and encounter the core of the general civilization in which we live. You go to a university. University is the greenhouse, the generating plant of Western civilization. In that kind of confrontation, your allegiance, your location in the periphery of your small and particular world will be affected in a significant way. You can grow up along the periphery of a secular world and encounter a core component of an outside civilization, a religious group somewhere. Again, your peripheral allegiance to your world will be affected by your experience with another core. So there's a third way. Periphery, core, culture confrontation. You can grow up along the periphery of your small and particular world and along the periphery of Western civilization. You know neither world very well. Periphery, culture confrontation. You want to know what a core culture confrontation looks like? Read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Stephen Dedalus, right at the heart of his Irish Catholicism, encounters an element right at the heart of Western civilization, its literature. You want to know what a periphery culture confrontation looks like? Read anything written in the first 10 years of Ernest Hemingway. Read the early works of Philip Roth. Read the Rabbit Angstrom novels of John Updike. Rabbit Angstrom, peripheral to everything in the world. That's the way we encounter small and particular alien ideas that come to us inside the small and particular worlds into which we're born. And much of the literature being created in the modern period and in the contemporary world gives us vivid pictures of this extraordinary choreography of confrontation. I must tell you that I am awed and very deeply grateful that so many others seem willing to share in what are essentially my own very particular concerns and preoccupations. Very grateful indeed. It's no small thing to feel oneself somewhat fulfilled, at least as a writer of stories, if not as a brain surgeon. Thank you all very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are delighted that you have stayed for the discussion, so many of you. And it's my pleasure to open the discussion for tonight. I must tell you, as I said before, that we have a little under an hour by now, but this hour can be used, of course, in the maximum way. I would suggest to have the discussion in two rounds, perhaps to start with the first round of first reactions to what Chaim Potok has just been saying, and perhaps I could ask some of the invited guests, if they wish to do so, to respond, and after that it's open to all of you, and there is a microphone up there in case you would wish to use it, and I think it would be very nice if perhaps you could mention your name. Everything is being recorded, but and if you wish, you could also say who you are and what your interests are, and then it's an open discussion until 25 minutes past 10. May I ask, there's always, of course, that embarrassing moment of the first question, but surely our guests are willing, and if not dying, to comment. Can I ask somebody to start with the first question, comment? Everything goes. Please, let's not waste time. Yes, certainly.
Well, Mr. Potok, I very much.
Perhaps, would you mind taking the microphone, because it's very difficult for people in the back, perhaps, otherwise to hear.
Mr. Potok, I very much appreciated your marvelous lecture, and I was left with some questions. You mentioned or you defined literature as the outcome of a clash with prevailing culture, as far as I understood you. And then you mentioned some pivotal writers who, in your opinion, were specific specimens of what you wanted to say. Examples, prime examples. You mentioned Mark Twain, to which I heartily agree. You mentioned Sinclair Lewis, to which I half-heartedly agree, and you mentioned Hemingway, to which I don't agree at all. But it struck me that you omitted to mention one of the most pivotal, most influential writers in our culture, one an anti-Semite and one a Jew, who far surpassed in value, in my opinion, the writers you mentioned, and who were very much more influential in influencing the course of Western civilization and literature. The one who for the first time perhaps showed that the heroes and heroines of literature, of the imagination, had a character of their own, and the one who not only showed that the heroines and the heroes of a novel have a character of their own, but probed the utter depths and horrors of the soul of these creatures. Of course, I mean Dostoevsky and Kafka. I wonder whether you omitted to mention them, because I think they are far much greater than all the writers you mentioned.
Oh, I didn't mention a lot of writers. As it was, I spoke too long this evening. I mentioned Hemingway simply as a writer who essentially explored individuals at home nowhere in this world. And one would say of him, I suppose, that his individuals, especially the Hemingway of the first 10 years or so, and especially the Hemingway of the novels, like The Sun Also Rises and The Farewell to Arms and so on, writing about individuals alienated and along the peripheries of whatever culture Western civilization had at that point in our history. But I mentioned Kafka earlier as one of the fathers, one of the founding fathers of modern Western civilization. I didn't mention Jane Austen. I didn't mention Dickens. There are many I didn't mention. Can't mention everybody. I was trying to give some examples of writers who had and who are exploring some of the components of the culture confrontation model that I presented this evening. Clearly there are many more. I have to make one more point, and that is this. I don't want to leave you with the impression that all of modern literature is engaged in an exploration or a giving of the picture of this kind of choreography that I tried to present to you this evening. That is singularly not the case. There are whole components of modern literature, as I indicated in the course of my talk, that are off on a track entirely their own. There is an aesthetic, a pure aesthetic stream in modern literature that isn't terribly interested in social, psychological, cultural issues. One might make a good case for Lawrence Stern as being represented as a representative of that literature, of William Gass, of Nabokov, as being representative of that purely aesthetic stream of literature, not interested, as I say, in cultural or social problems. I didn't learn from that stream when I was growing up. I learned from the other stream. It affected me profoundly, the essentially iconoclastic, image-breaking stream. Probably I learned from it because it was closest to what I was going through as an individual inside my own culture as I was growing up, and I needed a literature, a form to use in order to express what it was that I was going through myself. Clearly, there are many more names than the names that I listed, of individuals who are trying very hard to understand what it is that we're going through culturally as a species in the modern period.
Thank you. Next question or comment, please. Yes. Could you use the microphone, please, or be close to it?
This is not a question, this is just a comment. I would like to thank you for The Chosen. My name is Agnes Benjamin. I'm American. I've been living in Holland 14 years. And I grew up in Harlem in New York. And reading was a very important part of my family life. But the books that we read did not have anything to do with my culture. There was no black literature, really. I read Louisa May Alcott, Jane Austen, Mark Twain, and later Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and all the classics we were required to read in school. But you can understand, having grown up in Harlem in that kind of environment, I was not reading anything that I could identify with. And it wasn't until I was living here and I read The Chosen that I could understand living in a particular environment and having to make a choice about living within that environment or going outside and living in another environment. And I chose a very extreme, coming to live in Europe. But you made me understand that choice in The Chosen.
Thank you. One of the great powers of literature is the way it speaks across chasms that divide us. Writers write about small and particular worlds. Ellman, in his marvelous biography of Joyce, records a question that somebody sent to Joyce. Somebody asked Joyce, "Why do you only write about Dublin?" All of us know that Dublin was not exactly a swinging town at the turn of the century. It's not such a terrifically swinging town today, although it's more of a city today, significantly, than it was at the turn of the century. Why Dublin? That's when Joyce made that response that you cited earlier. Joyce's response to that question was, for myself, I always write about Dublin. Because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I'm citing you Joyce word for word. If I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of every city in the world. And then Joyce, being a very good Jesuit, son of Aquinas, who was a son of Aristotle, he adds the following remark: in the particular resides the universal. That's the Aristotelian concept of the concrete universal over against the Platonic notion of the world of ideas. The concrete universal, the specific embedded in details which all details might have in common. If I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities of the world. I'm writing about my specific. Novelists write about their own small and particular worlds. And somehow, something very mysterious occurs if they write about it skillfully enough and if they're lucky enough. Individuals coming to those novels from all the small and particular worlds that we as a species have generated for ourselves on this planet coming to this or that small and particular world of this or that novel, somehow they cross that dividing line, that chasm between the world of the novel and the world that they were brought up in, and the two worlds meet, and they're forever changed. Nothing is the same again. And suddenly you begin to see a world you never thought of before. It somehow drops down into your imagination, into your mental apparatus, as it were. And forever you will see that world through the vision, the model generated by this or that particular novel. If you read Dickens, your vision of Victorian England can never be the same when you're done with Dickens as it might have been before you came to Dickens. If you read Dostoevsky, your vision of Russia and Russian religion and the inside of certain kinds of Russians and what Russia was really all about at a certain moment in its cultural history, your vision of Russia can never be the same when you're finished with Dostoevsky as it might have been what it was before you came to Dostoevsky. This powerful model-making activity that we engage in, called the serious novel, is a unique enterprise on the western side of our planet for very complicated cultural reasons, I must say, that aren't entirely clear to us. There are novels in Japan, there are stories in China, there are novels in India. They don't quite have this kind of polarization element that typifies much of the literature, most of the literature, I would say, on the western side of the planet. And that has to do with some of the cultural adventures, as it were, that the western side of the planet experiences in the wake of Greek civilization, Roman civilization, Christian civilization, Jewish civilization, secularization, industrialization, cultural experiences unique to us on this side of the planet, all of which are reflected in one way or another by the serious fiction, the literature that we generate here. You might be interested in knowing, in response to your response to The Chosen, that as I was growing up and reading, and in the years after I had formed my own understanding of my world, two of the novels that affected me and continue to affect me profoundly are Native Son and Invisible Man. That's the power of this form of human expression called the serious novel.
Thank you very much. May I invite the next speaker, the next comment? And let me say, ladies and gentlemen, also in view of the time and also in view of the fact that Chaim Potok never likes boundaries, that we can already cross the boundary of, invited people over to everybody, because you're all invited, obviously. So please come forward if you wish to comment, either on the address or now also, of course, on individual books.
Don't be afraid to ask.
That's right. Yes.
My name is Walker. I teach American literature at the University of Groningen. Mr. Potok, one of your compatriots wrote a very interesting book recently. I don't remember the title of the book, nor do I really remember the name of the author of the book. It sounds like a Japanese mountain, but I keep forgetting the name. But he predicted the end of ideologies and the end of Western history, in fact. Now, thank you. Now, if that's true, then there is precious little left for writers like you to write about, if this is true. So I would like to have your comment on that book. Did you read it, by the way?
Can you mention the name of the author, because it's a
Fujisawa. Yes, it
Fujisawa.
sounds like a Japanese
Yes,
mountain.
yes, it's yes. That's what
Beg your pardon? Yes, the end of history, well, implying the end of ideology.
it's an essay, isn't it? It's an essay in a leading journal.
People have been predicting the end of history for a long time. There's a history of predictions of this kind that lasts quite a while. In any event, there is a book by, if I remember correctly, Daniel Bell called The End of Ideology, or the Age of Ideology, which is a serious work of intellectual history in the United States. And it is one of the significant problems of the modern period. There seems to be a leveling out, a kind of homogenization of cultures in Western civilization, which we all have to be concerned about. My own feeling is that if it happens at all, it happens so far into the future that it's not an immediate concern, certainly not of mine. And my own feeling is that insofar as our quarrelsome species is concerned, the notion that all of us will end up believing in one thing is not a terribly realistic thing for us to contend with. Even if we end up in a politicized entity that has one money, no boundaries, total unification of the planet, whatever dream you want to dream, 200, 300, 500 years down the pike, my feeling is that being as nettlesome as we are, and as individualistic as we are, as quarrelsome as we are, as beset by problems that seem to be thoroughly endemic to our very nature as a species, and being to some extent a fairly close reader of Sigmund Freud and his view of the battleground we call the family. My own reading of the human situation is that we don't have to worry too much about the homogenization of human ideology. I think it's going to continue for a long time, and it will serve as a good challenge for politicians, for diplomats. It'll be a very fine way for them to make a serious living by keeping us all talking to each other in spite of all the differences that we're going to continue to generate. I'm not terribly concerned about an end to human history.
Well, I think I agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I want to make a commentary on what you just talked about. The guy's called Fukuyama, and it was an article in the National Interest, which basically predicted that liberal democracy would win all over the world now that communism is falling apart. But I wanted to ask you a question about that, because he's working at the State Department. Now the State Department, as you know as an American, is a particular culture in and of its own, which has its own core values. And I was wondering if you as an American think that someone coming up with such an article and such an idea, if only to throw it on the table to discuss it, if that's a particular example of a culture that's typical for Washington maybe, or for the State Department, and as such is an example of what you were talking about in your lecture.
Is this typical of the way the State Department thinks? My own feeling is that so many different kinds of position papers are generated by individuals in our State Department that it's more than difficult to say what's typical of the way the State Department thinks. Policy in the State Department is generated by certain kinds of individuals who very often plug into some of these position papers and try to figure out how to create policy, how to use them, at what time to use them. Discussions abound, and so on and so forth. The mechanism of decision-making is fairly complex, and in the end, it's probably the president and his own particular feelings about this or that situation vis-a-vis the American political situation that often determines what policy is. We have many kinds of position papers written by this or that, many individuals in the State Department. This particular one might have been pulled out and gotten published because of a wide interest that an editor might have seen in its readership. It's very difficult to know. I suspect that there are papers lying somewhere in the files of the State Department, which if an editor of this or that magazine could go through, would really shake up readers in Western civilization. It's best that they lie where they are. That's one of the great things about living in a democracy. One wants the full range of thought. One wants to be as prepared as possible with contingency plans. And then after all this preparation is done, the world still ends up surprising you, and you don't quite know how to maneuver, for example, in the kind of situation that we're living through today, which, with all the position papers that have probably been written on communism, still catches everybody by surprise. Not only the American State Department, but I suggest all foreign ministries all over the world, especially in Western civilization. That's the nature of the human enterprise, and that's why I said earlier that I'm not terribly concerned about there being an end to history or an end to ideology. We, by our very natures, constantly generate surprises, notions, ideas, reactions that surprise us all. If we could predict human action, as Comte, C-O-M-T-E, Comte once thought we might be able to do, history would be a kind of H.G. Wellsian bore, you know, that trip to the future that that individual took in his time machine. It's not terribly likely that that's realistic, certainly not in the foreseeable future. So let's not worry too much about that.
Yes, please.
Potok, my name is Hestels. I guess I'm just an amateur reader. What I would like to ask you is this. In your talk, you very much emphasize, I think in a wonderful way, how out of conflict and rebellion literature could be born. Also, you said in literature, to modern literature, nothing is sacred. What I would like to know is, particularly for somebody from your background and upbringing, is that you have not very much talked about how within the same culture you also can have conflicts. For instance, between, let's say, freedom of expression and religious beliefs, which are sacred to many people. Of course, in the back of my mind, I think of the Rushdie affair. I would very much like to have your views, not particularly on this case, but about these cultural shocks of a different nature.
You certainly,
it's not 4 o'clock in the morning.
The question is, can you have confrontations inside a given culture? And the answer is certainly. The Chosen is precisely about that sort of confrontation inside the core of a culture. Any living culture has at its core at least 2 elements in ongoing confrontation. One element says, I don't want to mix with a culture outside my own. If I have problems, I'm going to solve my problems my own way. To bring another culture in is to dilute my culture or to contaminate my culture. I will use elements from the outside culture that aren't a threat to me and that will enhance my reading of my culture. That, in The Chosen, is the position of Danny Saunders' father, this very pietist individual, this very religious man. At the same time, right in the heart of The Chosen, right at the core of that culture, is an element that says, wait a minute. There are some great things out there. I mean, psychology teaches us something about the human being. Anthropology teaches us something about the structure of human society. Sociology teaches us something about human interaction in society. Why don't we bring the good things outside our culture into the culture and enrich ourselves in the process? Any living culture has at least those 2 elements in ongoing tension. Catholicism had it all through the Middle Ages. It had it from its very beginning. Whole elements of Protestantism had it. Islam has it today. Judaism has it today. It is natural for a culture to have at its core at least these two elements or shadings of these two elements in confrontation. And in The Chosen, these two elements are together brought into confrontation with an element from outside the culture, from the general civilization in which we live, an element called Freudian psychoanalytic theory. No God, no supernatural, no rabbi, no priest. The one component of Western civilization that Freud was thoroughly antagonistic to, almost to a polemical fury, was its religion. He was cool about everything in Western civilization, but when it came to writing about religion, he really went out of his way to affect an attack stance, a very un-Freudian and unscientific attack stance that is still a little bewildering to people who read Freud. What do you do with Freud when you come to Freud from any religious system, Christian, Jewish, Islamic? Well, one thing you do with Freud, you walk away from it. In other words, you have nothing to do with Freud. Another way of handling it is to say, well, let me take some of the good things out of Freud. His psychoanalytic technique, the concept of the psychological man, the therapeutic techniques, the investigative techniques in Freud. Let me use those as scientific tools to investigate the dimensions of a certain kind of human suffering, and let me disregard his anthropology. Let me have nothing to do with Freud's view of man, Freud's version of the human family as a battleground, a perennial battleground of emotions, feelings, repressions, neuroses. That has nothing to do with my understanding of the nature of man. That's what Danny Saunders ends up doing. He solves the culture confrontation problem by compartmentalizing. He takes a certain part of Freud, links with that, discards the rest of Freud, will have nothing to do with it. You might say to yourself, what kind of way is that to handle another culture? You pick, you choose, you throw things out, you take things in. Is that a legitimate intellectual enterprise? And the answer is, it sure is. That's precisely what we always do. We go through a process of selective affinity. We select out of an alien culture those elements toward which we feel a measure of affinity, with which we feel comfortable. The other elements we discard. Indeed, the founding fathers of Western civilization did exactly that. Rousseau, Diderot, Voltaire skipped backwards over more than 1,000 years of Christendom and locked with the lovely, cool, rational components of Roman and Greek thought. The Stoics, the skeptics, the dramatists, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, the Sophocles. Those were the heroes of the founding fathers of our modern civilization. Forgetting entirely about the orgiastic elements, the mystery religions of Greco-Roman civilization, its lusts, its hungers for power, its viciousness, its violence, that they forgot about. They locked with the elements toward which they felt a measure of affinity. That's what Danny Saunders does in The Chosen. That's what we all do when we encounter an alien body of material, parts of which attract us, parts of which repel us. All religions have at their hearts those elements in tension with themselves. And in The Chosen, I took those elements into confrontation with an element from outside any body of religion, an element that's a gift to us from the general world, an element we call Freudian psychoanalytic theory. How do you pick? How do you choose? What do you do? How do you react?
Could I ask you here, Mr. Potok, that what you're pleading for in philosophical terms would be a kind of subjective eclecticism that you take the best from what you get and leave the rest. Whereas often, of course, enough there is the danger in doing that it becomes so utterly subjective that it's difficult to pass this on to others, for instance, because how would one ever enter in a dialogue if you say, well, this is just how I select, and how does one still continue a dialogue with other selections?
Am I advocating this? I don't advocate anything. It is not the business of a novelist to advocate. Preachers should advocate. Teachers, I think, to some extent, should advocate. Even a teacher in a university teaches a position. I don't think it's the job of a novelist to advocate. I think that if a novelist begins to advocate, what he ends up or she ends up doing is writing didactic, preachy pages which go soft and which nobody reads, and rightfully so. They shouldn't be written, they shouldn't be read if they are written. I'm trying to describe, as best I can, a very broad cultural dynamic that is going on our side of the planet at this point in our history as a species. When I started to write, I thought that I was writing only about Jews, and that only Jews went through this experience. The Chosen is published in the United States, and suddenly I'm getting calls from Calvinist College in the Midwest, from a Catholic university, from Notre Dame, from a Catholic seminary, from a Baptist place here. They're asking me to come, talk to their students, stay on the campus for a while, teach secular universities. And I'm asking myself, what have I done here? I didn't understand what was going on until I suddenly realized that by sheer chance, I had tapped into a dynamic that we are all going through. It is not typical only of one group at this point in our history. The culture highways are wide open. We are all traveling them. I am not advocating what Danny Saunders does. I am not advocating what Ruve Malta does. He takes text criticism, will use it only on the Talmud, will not use it on the Bible because that's the sacred text of the Jewish tradition. All of Jewish law, all of rabbinic law is predicated on the notion that the biblical text is fixed. All of American constitutional law is predicated on the notion that the wording of the Constitution is fixed. Think of what might happen to American constitutional law if somebody suddenly dug a hole somewhere in Philadelphia and found a later version of the Constitution that was the real Constitution, and it was different, not in degree, but in kind in certain sections. I mean, what would go on? Well, that's precisely the sort of thing that goes on in Bible criticism. You begin to play with the text of the Bible, whole areas of rabbinic law suddenly shift on you, and you don't know what to do. Ruve Malta says, I'll have nothing to do with it. I call that kind of handling of a cultural confrontation, I call that culture compartmentalization. Two cultures live side by side in antagonism, and the individual caught up in this process picks and chooses very carefully from the antagonistic culture what he or she will lock with. Those elements he or she brings into his own culture, the other elements you forget. You have nothing to do with. However, you're absolutely right. Doesn't work that way all the time. It especially doesn't work that way when you're dealing with the arts, with the humanities. It's easy to do with the sciences, because science is essentially a reading of, as it were, the material world. Religion is a reading of the spiritual world. So you build a wall between the two worlds. It's difficult to do with the humanities because the humanities sort of cross over. They seep under the door, over the wall, through the wall. They make statements about religious man, secular man. Art is art for a religious person as well as it is for a secular. It's hard to read literature and not be affected as a religious person, as I was. That's an enterprise that I call culture fusion. That's when the two cultures don't meet this way, and one individual is standing here and looking at the other one and locking with certain elements of it at his or her choice, but that's when the cultures meet this way. And both sides of the equation are profoundly affected. And out of that fusion comes something new, unpredictable. No one can predict what happens in culture fusion. That's why Asher Lev ends up the way he does. He experiences what I call culture fusion. The painter, Asher Lev, the individual whose story I told in the third of my novels. That's his experience, culture fusion. Very different. Which culture experience should you have? You want me to tell you? That's not my business to tell you. It's your business to decide that for yourselves. You are probably going through all the experiences that I described earlier this evening. You have been through all the experiences. Court, periphery, court, periphery. In some instances, you might be going through all those experiences in one day, in 1 hour. That's the nature of what it is that we're going through at this point in our history. I don't advocate, I describe as best I can. I am telling stories.
Thank you very much for that very beautiful answer. Next question, please. Yes?
My name is Derek Rubin. I'm working on a doctoral dissertation on Saul Bellows' fiction, which I think in a sense is related to what you were speaking about this evening. I'm sure you're familiar with Robert Park's notion of marginality, which has been mentioned a great deal in connection with Jewish American literature. And I wanted to ask, do you see your idea of core to core, core to periphery, etc., confrontation as a sort of systematic elaboration upon Park's idea, or part of it? Or didn't you have his notion, or what he calls the catastrophic theory of progress in mind when talking about this? There seem to me to be similarities.
If he wrote, that I have Parks' notion and his scheme in mind, if he wrote after 1967, then I precede him. Because as I reread some of the interviews I gave in the wake of The Chosen, this idea is already prevalent. So it depends upon when he wrote. And my feeling is that marginality is one component of what it is that I'm trying to say. Marginality and somebody peripherally attached to a culture are simply two different ways of saying the same thing. And if you want to see how Bellow fits into this scheme of things, read a novel like Herzog by Bellow. Herzog, along the periphery of his small and particular world, in that instance the Jewish world, and right at the heart of Western civilization, its university world. You want to see what that kind of confrontation looks like inside a human being? How that kind of confrontation affects his feelings and his thinkings, his relationship to women, his relationship to himself, his relationship to his child. If you want to see how that looks, read Herzog by Saul Bellow. Periphery, core, culture confrontation. Marginality is another way of saying peripheral man.
Not really, because, well, Park wrote in the 1920s and 30s, and although his notion of marginality is in some ways not clear, perhaps because of the very use of the word marginality, because of the meaning being on the margin, but what he implied there was that there's a clash of cultures, and what he calls, as I said, what he calls the catastrophic theory of progress, this clash of cultures which creates new cultures, and so we move on.
Well, I was not familiar with that idea, but it sounds like something I ought to read and will. Thank you very much for bringing that to my attention.
Yes, there are 10 minutes left, ladies and gentlemen, so please use the time.
My name is Scott Rollins. I'm busy translating in books and promoting the translation of books. It may be a peripheral question. It may be a core question. First of all, America, given its monolingualism in the main, is not used to reading much in translation. It's been my experience. You have been translated into many languages. It may be a personal question, which I hope may be of greater interest. Have your translators, or have you taken an interest in your translations and have discovered something about what got lost from the periphery to the periphery, or the core to the core, where a translator might say, what does that mean? How am I going to put that in my language? Which is a small question in terms of cultural bridge building, which is what translation is. And the second question is, on a broader scale, how do you feel about the relative lack of knowledge of foreign languages in the US and in educational system, or people reading translations? Do you feel that is changing with the emergence of Spanish as a second language, for example? It's been my experience, being an American, having lived here for 17 years, once I learned one foreign language, whole worlds opened up to me, which I could read in the original language, but of course I appreciated translations. Because of Dostoevsky, I had to read in English, of course. How do you feel about translations?
Well, America is a very large country with 2 oceans and no enemies. When you have 2 oceans and no enemies, the chances are fairly good that you're not going to learn a foreign language. First of all, one of the reasons you learn a foreign language is to understand what the enemy is saying, for a very practical reason. The insularity and the provinciality of American culture is notorious to a point of being a cliche, until a sudden flood into America of immigrants from Western and Central Europe in the early 1930s as a result of the Hitler regime in Germany. To a very great extent, it was that immigrant generation that created the beginnings of what we now call American culture. This was certainly true in the area of painting. Native American literature really begins, to some extent, with Mark Twain, and to a very great extent with the Midwestern writers around the period of the First World War. Many of those Midwestern writers ended up in Europe precisely because they felt the provinciality of the American cultural scene. Some New England writers ended up in Europe. Henry James lived in Europe. Hemingway spent his formative years as an artist in Europe. Fitzgerald was here for a while. So many Americans were here in the post-World War I period. So it is no surprise to Americans to be told that culture for a long time was rather thin in America. At the same time, one has to say that the major creative, seminal activity in literature in Western civilization today, for the good or for the bad, is going on in the United States, especially in the area that was once considered dead, the novel. That's why I don't get upset when people begin to predict the homogenization of Western civilization, the death of history, the end of ideology. The novel was dead 30 years ago. The novel is a charged, living, pulsing enterprise. There's an awful lot of garbage being written, an awful lot of very good entertainment fiction being written, and a considerable amount of really significant literature. And so much of it is being generated in the United States today. I read Mann in an English translation. I didn't know German at the time. I read Flaubert originally in an English translation. Didn't know French at the time. I read Camus in English. Discovered only after I had learned French how pretty bad the first English translation of Camus was. It is very difficult to translate from one language to another, because the richest element of a language is essentially its untranslatable components. That is to say, its flavor-filled, idiosyncratic idioms, which are very often generated by how the cheese smells and tastes in a certain province in France or Holland, and no American can even begin to understand what's being said or talked about. Having said that, one adds the old cliche that somebody once said about translations: it's like kissing your bride through her veil. Having said that, one has to say at the same time that without translations, we will be all the poorer. And that a really great novel, a really great work of literature, does not lose its core in a translation, no matter how bad the translation may be. I read Tolstoy in Garnett's translation. People tell me that in Russian it's an altogether different experience. I got Russia through those translations of Tolstoy and through those translations of Dostoevsky. I don't know Russian, not terribly likely that I will ever master it to a point where I can really appreciate the nuances of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. I'm thoroughly convinced that I have caught the essential. Many of those Midwestern writers ended up in Europe precisely because they felt the provinciality of the American cultural scene. Some New England writers ended up in Europe. Henry James lived in Europe. Hemingway spent his formative years as an artist in Europe. Fitzgerald was here for a while. So many Americans were here in the post-World War I period. So it is no surprise to Americans to be told that culture for a long time was rather thin in America. At the same time, one has to say that the major creative, seminal activity in literature in Western civilization today, for the good or for the bad, is going on in the United States, especially in the area that was once considered dead, the novel. That's why I don't get upset when people begin to predict the homogenization of Western civilization, the death of history, the end of ideology. The novel was dead 30 years ago. The novel is a charged, living, pulsing enterprise. There's an awful lot of garbage being written, an awful lot of very good entertainment fiction being written, and a considerable amount of really significant literature. And so much of it is being generated in the United States today. I read Mann in an English translation. I didn't know German at the time. I read Flaubert originally in an English translation. Didn't know French at the time. I read Camus in English. Discovered only after I had learned French how pretty bad the first English translation of Camus was. It is very difficult to translate from one language to another, because the richest element of a language is essentially its untranslatable components. That is to say, its flavor-filled, idiosyncratic idioms, which are very often generated by how the cheese smells and tastes in a certain province in France or Holland, and no American can even begin to understand what's being said or talked about. Having said that, one adds the old cliche that somebody once said about translations: it's like kissing your bride through her veil. Having said that, one has to say at the same time that without translations, we will be all the poorer. And that a really great novel, a really great work of literature, does not lose its core in a translation, no matter how bad the translation may be. I read Tolstoy in Garnett's translation. People tell me that in Russian it's an altogether different experience. I got Russia through those translations of Tolstoy and through those translations of Dostoevsky. I don't know Russian, not terribly likely that I will ever master it to a point where I can really appreciate the nuances of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. I'm thoroughly convinced that I have caught the essential nature of Russia through those novels. I learned French after reading Camus and Flaubert. I know what has happened to those translations in English, and I still say that I caught the essential nature of Flaubert and Camus in the English translation. It was a great pleasure to read, especially Camus in the French afterwards. But I had not missed the central thrust of those great works of literature. Umberto Eco, by the way, is a bestseller in the United States. Now was a bestseller in his first novel. We read him in translation. But you're absolutely right. When you have about 250 million individuals speaking the same language in various dialects, but pretty much the same language, and when you have the powerful unifying thrust that the modern media constitute, you generally will have a whole nation that is essentially provincial and really thinks that maybe the rest of the world ought to talk our language instead of us learning the other languages of the world. Very provincial, admittedly so, very wrong. We Americans are the poorer for it, for not learning other languages, for not being taught other languages. I will be the first one to admit that. And I wish it were otherwise. For our sakes, I wish that were otherwise.
Just follow up. What's your personal experience, your translations? Have you had any?
My personal experience with my translations is that essentially the cores have remained intact, and I say that about the French. I cannot read Dutch, so I can't say it about the Dutch, although I'm told that. I say that about the Spanish. I say that about, to some extent, about the Italian, which I can follow, the German, and the Hebrew. Although I must say at the same time that there are very fascinating errors that occur in some of those translations. The French translation has the baseball game of The Chosen taking place on Saturday. Samedi. That's because the translator read Sunday, which is when the game takes place, as Sabbath. Sabbath is Saturday. Now, no way is it possible for those yeshiva boys to play that game on a Sabbath. The Hebrew translation doesn't know what to do with the Battle of the Bulge that took place near the end of the Second World War. Those of you old enough to remember the last German offensive of the war, it punched through the Ardennes forest and broke the American line in two and headed for, I think it was Antwerp. The idea was to cut Europe into two and then start negotiating for peace. Instead, the American line began to hold, and instead of being sliced entirely in two, it bulged backwards and contained the German offensive. Now, in American journalism, that offensive got to be called the Battle of the Bulge. That was I don't know what it was called in Europe. It was probably called the Ardennes Offensive here. But we called it the Battle of the Bulge. Now, the Hebrew translator in Israel is translating this novel, and he or she, I'm not sure who, I can't remember, I think it was a he, it was a she, gets to the Battle of the Bulge, doesn't know the idiom, so translates it as the Battle of the City of Bulgia. But it doesn't change the thrust of the long passage. But these are the interesting little stories that I've collected. One day I think I'll write a little essay on what it is that happens in translation. But the essential cores really remain intact.
Yes, please. I'm sorry to say that this will have to be the last question. I'm going to put in a very small question that will interest you probably, because Mr. Potok will give you some information. I'm sure that he already gave away on Monday, but many people will want to hear about your next novel. But first, perhaps, your question. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Potok, for your exciting lecture. It is possible that I now understand a little bit more of your books after having heard you. Nevertheless, I still have some problems, and I want to illustrate it with a few examples. My name is Daniel Meyers, and I'm working as an anthropologist.
Excuse me, can you use the microphone a little bit, because we all want to hear what you're going to say.
I'm trying.
Yes, you're doing fine.
I'm working as an anthropologist at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and my specialization is Hasidic life. and especially the Lubavitcher Hasidim, called, if I remember well, a lot of Hasidim in your books, especially in Asher Lev. I think I recognize many people in your books, especially maybe you lived at Eastern Parkway, as I just heard. Maybe it is a well-known name to you. Mendel Futervas, the one you call Yudo Krinsky. At the same time, Yudo Krinsky is also a real person, but you describe him in another way. Yudo Krinsky is one of the secretaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So there are many aspects from which I see that you try to describe them in the way you perceive them. But what I miss is what I could call the real Hasidic mentality. I see the shartuk, the traditional garb where the Hasidim are dressed in, and I see the beard and the side locks and everything, but I don't see the let's say the inner aspects. I see the many things of the inner meanings of Hasidic life, and that is a difficult thing for me. If it is your intention to have a confrontation between cultures, then it is. I think it is important to describe them in the right way. And sometimes I'm afraid it is quite difficult for me to understand them. Let's say when I look at Reb Saunders, well, as I saw him in your books, he is more the kind of a mixture of a Lithuanian Jew and an American Protestant fundamentalist than a real Hasidic Rebbe. It is the strangest Rebbe I ever seen. Maybe there is in Hasidism something like educating with silence. I tell you the truth, I don't know about it, but there's so much in Hasidism. It's quite possible that I don't know everything, probably. But it is strange. It is very strange. Is it typical for Hasidism what you are writing? Let's say you are speaking about Asher Lev. The kind of problem, the kind of conflict Asher Lev has, I have never found, especially not with the two Lubavitcher painters that I have known very well. First of all, Hendel Lieberman, who had a connection with the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and was very famous. And sometimes I have an idea that he is a kind of background for your books, because he had a pupil, Borg Nachshon, who's now a very famous Israeli painter, and I have known both very well. Hendel Lieberman is not alive anymore, and Borg Nachshon was a good friend of me. My impression was I have known them very well, and the conflicts you talk about, as far as I know, are not their conflicts. Well, I have known there was also a painter, Potok. So my question is, who are you describing? Are you describing my Hasidim, or are you describing a conflict with Mr. Potok? I think that is the strongest way I can push my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There are a lot of questions here, and I'll try to answer them very quickly because the night is growing late, and we all have to get up and go to work tomorrow morning. I told you earlier in the night that all that a writer of stories can do is give you his or her own model of the world. Now, you are going to ask me, is the world really like this model of the world? Is this model true about the world? I don't know what it means to be true about the world with a capital T. My bet would be that if you asked 5 Lubavitcher Hasidim to draw for you models of Lubavitcher Hasidism in the modern period, that you would get overlaps among the 5 and significant differentia among those 5 models. Novelists don't purport to tell the truth about the world because we don't know what the truth with a capital T is about the world. We communicate our own visions of the world. Now, it's interesting to me that you tell me that my vision is a dubious one, because I did not know a Yudel Krinsky existed. Had I known a Yudel Krinsky existed, I certainly would not have used the name. That's the last thing in the world a novelist does, is use an actual name that he's familiar with. It's interesting to me that I tapped into an existing name without knowing the name exists, which tells me already something about my affinity toward that world. It's also of interest to me, and you might be interested in this, that my world was a Hasidic world. My mother, of blessed memory, was a direct descendant of one of the sons of the Rizhiner Rebbe, and told me over and over and over again how her great-great-great-great-granduncle, give or take 1 or 2 greats, was the Berditchever Rebbe, one of the greatest of the Hasidic Rebbes. I grew up with this as part of my very being, and my father himself was a follower of Belzer Hasidim in Europe before he came to the United States. I think if you read Asher Lev carefully, without the screening and defensive mechanism that you probably bring to it, that you would see how much of Hasidism there really is in that book. And you will see how much more of Hasidism there is in the next book that will, I hope, be published in the spring. It's seen not through Asher Lev, but through Asher Lev's description of his father. The prayers in the synagogue. His father lighting the candles on Hanukkah. The singing that goes on for Zmirot on Shabbat in the house. The father is always singing. Why the description of the Zmirot, the songs that take place in a traditional Jewish home around the Sabbath table that are part of the meal? What's going on over there? Why do I spend so much time describing that? What about his father's preoccupation with saving Jews all over the world, especially Russian Jews, with creating yeshivas all over the world? That isn't part of Hasidism? That isn't part of the heart of the Jewish tradition? Indeed, Asher Lev's commitment to art is polarized against Asher Lev's father's commitment to his particular sects, Hasidic sects, reading of its place in the world. It is dedicated to saving souls, to saving bodies, to creating Jews and Jewish institutions. And Asher Lev has another destiny. So the book has to be read with care in order to get the Hasidic side of the book, which is represented by his father. The passages with the meeting with the Rebbe, who's the head of this particular Hasidic sect, those are sacred confrontations. And even Asher Lev, who has all this problem with his group, presents them that way. He goes into those meetings with trepidation, with awe, with love for this man. The section in the book where he studies the writings of the founder of this sect are filled with love and questions about the writings. Those are taken very seriously. Asher Lev is a haunted individual. It is not impossible for the most sacred and cut off of sects to generate individuals of this kind. If Spain can generate a Picasso, the Ladover can generate an Asher Lev. Where genius comes from is the single greatest mystery, I think, of our species. But one thing you can say about genius is that it is utterly unpredictable. It can come from a village in India. It can come from a mountaintop somewhere in Siberia. It can come from the streets of Brooklyn and from Barcelona in Spain, Catholic Spain. We don't understand the essential nature of this mystery called genius. Reb Saunders, very close to somebody I knew. Reb Saunders, very close to one of the mysterious of the Rebbes, the Kotzker Rebbe, a man who sat in silence for 20 years and wouldn't communicate with his people. Even Lithuanian rabbis talk to their people. You think the Hasidim only jump up and down all the time? You think the Hasidim are only holy rollers? Some of them are profound thinkers, profound individuals who feel profoundly the pain of the world and try somehow to transform it or lock with it. The Kotzker was also a Hasidic rabbi, a Rebbe who lived about the turn of the 1800s in a little village called Kutsk, who for the last 20 years of his life was totally silent. There are Rebbes like that, locked inside themselves in turmoil over what it is that the world is really like. I'm not writing a piece of propaganda for Hasidism. I'm writing about people in conflict. If you tell me that Lubavitch cannot generate an Asher Lev, I'll agree with you. I'm not going to argue with you. But I'm not writing about the Lubavitcher Hasidim. I'm writing about the Ladover Hasidim, people that I invented. They generated an Asher Lev. And that's the individual that I was trying to write about. I must tell you also, and with this I'll conclude, there are people who say that the love affair and Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms could not conceivably exist. If you read A Farewell to Arms, Catherine Barclay and Frederick Henry are making love all over that hospital. We know about those hospitals. There weren't many private places in them. And the woman who was supposed to be the model for Catherine Barclay in the novel said that the love affair is impossible. It's simply inconceivable. Could not have taken place the way Hemingway describes it in the novel. And my response to that is, who cares? I don't read a novelist for the novelist to tell me about the truth of this or that event. I'm reading a novelist to see whether what is generated out of that novelist's imagination somehow affects me and my vision of the world. You want to read truth with a capital T? I don't know where to send you. But if you want to read an accurate description of this or that component of the world, go to a scientific magazine. Don't read a novel. A novel is another kind of human experience. It's a locking with model-making activity that our species engages in, model-making activity using the arabesques of language, style, and the imagination in order to generate a world with which the reader can interact. And that's what I try to do in my stories, create those worlds.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the applause, but there will have to be another applause in a minute. I just wanted to ask one very simple question, but it's a question which I know is in the hearts and heads of many of us, and the answer has already been given by Chaim Potok on Monday. But the question is very simple. What is the title of your next book? When is it going to come out?
The next book is called, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, The next book is called The Gift of Asher Lev. And it will, God willing, come out sometime in the spring of the next year, 1990. It's a continuation of the story of Asher Lev, and it brings him up to 1988, up to virtually today.
Thank you very much for that very brief and interesting answer. Ladies and gentlemen, our time is more than up. I shall use very few words to thank Chaim Potok. I speak on behalf of all of you, I'm sure, to thank you very much for your wonderful
privilege
lecture.
And a pleasure.
And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.